Welcome to lesson 6 and it's 5, integers. After today's lesson, we should be able to identify integers and determine if a situation is positive, negative, or 0. And then we're also going to be able to compare and order integers. And we're even going to take that one step further and work it with rational numbers as well. All right, so here we go. All right, first thing we're going to talk about the number line. So as a reminder, a number line that goes from side to side or left to right is your horizontal number line. We're also going to take a look at those number lines that go up and down. These are called vertical number lines. And we are going to fill our vertical number line in, but we're going to count by ones and not by fives. So now as a reminder, those numbers that go above the 0, so we're talking about these right in here, those numbers are going to be your positive numbers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. Now those numbers that are below 0, those numbers are your negative numbers. Notice they go in the same order, so -1, -2, -3, and so on. They go in the same order, but they're going in the opposite direction. So negative numbers, you count much in the same way, but everything you know about those positive numbers is opposite in the negative world. Interestingly enough, negative numbers are called opposites as well, so keep that in mind when working with those negative numbers. Typically, we'll use a vertical number line when we're talking about like temperature. So when you watch a thermometer, you watch the mercury kind of rise up on that number line with all those numbers on it to tell you what the temperature of the liquid or whatever the case may be is. You also use vertical number lines when we are working with elevation. You'll see that a lot with elevation. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and take the next step and start looking at integers in situations. Now remembering that integers, so for right now we're working with numbers that have no decimals and no fractions, but now they can be positive or negative. All right, so Andy loves to go scuba diving. For those of us that don't know what scuba diving is, that's when you put the air tank on your back and you have a mask on your face and you go underwater and you can swim for a long time because you can breathe using that air tank. So he jumps off of his boat and into the water. When he radios back to the boat, they tell him he is 30 feet below sea level. So it's important to note that he is at 30 feet and that it is below sea level. So he's down underneath whatever sea level is. Since it's below sea level, this tells us that this is a negative 30 feet in elevation. So you have to think of your elevation as its own number line. So we don't have these number lines that are just really floating around in real life. But if you look at the next question, it says when he surfaced, he was at sea level. What was his elevation? Well, you have above sea level, below sea level, and then you just have sea level itself. Think of your number line. You have above, and this is above 0. And then you have below, and this is below 0. And then you have 0. 0 is just kind of its own spot. It's that halfway in between those positives and negatives. So in this case, sea level is an elevation of 0 feet. Now, keeping in mind that that's sea level. That doesn't mean that if you go out onto Lake Michigan and you're floating on the water that you are at 0 feet or at sea level. You have to be legitimately at the sea, floating on the surface of the sea. Because there actually are places in the U.S. and all over the world that are below sea level and they're not underwater. All right, so sea level is just that plane, that space where 0 is. Okay. So then now he was at 30 feet below sea level when he was scuba diving, which makes sense. He went underwater, and typically below sea level is going to mean underwater. Then he was at 0 feet because he was at sea level, and now he climbed into the boat and was 8 feet above sea level. Above in this case telling us that it was up, so in this case it was 8 feet, and we just leave it as 8. We don't put a positive sign in there at all. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the next situation. We have 3 that we're going to try together. So we have weather. Weather very often works with integers and rational numbers in positives and negatives. So we have Wisconsin, where the coldest temperature on record is 55 degrees, and that's below 0. We'll look at our number line. Below 0, we already know that those are negative numbers. So this would be shown as a negative 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The warmest day, however, was 114 degrees. Now notice there's no above or below. Well, just like when you talk about positive numbers, like if I write the number 6, I don't write a positive sign in front of it. We just know it's positive because there's no sign. So in this case, we know it's above 0 because there is no indication that it's below. So when we talk about the temperature, we don't say, oh, it's 75 degrees above 0. We just say it's 75 degrees. So there are situations where you're not going to talk about above or below, where you're not going to talk about above, but you will always be given an indication if it's below. So in this case, this is 114 degrees Fahrenheit. Now for this one, we're talking about the temperature. So if I said it's 0 degrees, it would literally be 0 degrees because we're talking about the temperature itself. If we were talking about the change in temperature, then 0 would have a different meaning. 0 would mean that the temperature did not go up and it did not go down. So again, you have to read very carefully and see what you're talking about. Are you talking about the temperature? Or are you talking about the change in temperature? Are you talking about your money in your bank account or the change in the money in your bank account? All right, so let's look at the next situation. So here we're talking about a raise of $14,450. So a raise means you get more money put into your salary. So that's going to be a positive thing. So that is a positive $14,450. Now we have a cut of $10,000. That's not so great. So here what we're doing is we're talking about the change in the salary. We're not talking about the salary itself. We're talking about how it's changing. So in our first scenario, we got a raise. Awesome. In our second scenario, we got a cut. Yeek, that's not so good. That's going to be a negative. That's going to get taken away from your salary. So that would be a negative $10,000. Now, again, that means money got taken away. That does not mean you have a negative $10,000 that you're getting paid. If that's the case, you're paying your employer $10,000 for you to work for them. I don't suggest that you work there anymore then. What if my salary were to stay the same? So in this case, there's no change. Well, if a positive change meant I got a raise, so I got more money, and if a negative change, so it was a cut, so I got less money, no change would be a 0 because I'm not getting more money, I'm not getting less money, nothing is happening. Think of it kind of like in science. You have protons, which have a positive charge, you have electrons, which have a negative charge, and then you have those nice little neutrons in the middle that have no charge. No change is going to be your neutron. It's going to be your 0. All right, so let's look at the next situation. So Lauren checks her bank account each day. She withdrew $10. So right away, it's telling us what's happening to the bank account. It's telling us how is the bank account changing. So on Monday, she withdrew $10. So withdrawing means she took it out of her bank account. So when she sees that show up on paper, it's going to show up as a negative $10 because it came out of her account. But then a $125 paycheck was deposited on Tuesday. Deposited means it goes into your bank account. So that's going to stay as a positive $125. And then on Friday, it said 0. Well, does that mean she has nothing in her bank account? Be careful, because on Monday, it wasn't that she had negative $10. It's that she took 10 out. That was how it changed. On Tuesday, she put $125 in. That's how it changed. So the 125 was a change of $125. The negative 10 was a change of negative $10. So what does a change of 0 mean? Well, in this case, it means no money was deposited, so there was no deposit. And it also means that there was no withdrawal. So if there was no deposit and no withdrawal, 0 in this case means that there was no change in her bank account on Friday. It means something very different. So a lot of times students say, oh, that means she has $0. No, you have to look at it because it's talking about the change. So a 0 means nothing happened. All right, we're going to take the next step here. We're going to take a look at how to compare and order integers. And we are going to take it one step further. We do have a couple of problems here that have some decimals in them. So we're going to look at some rational numbers. The main focus is the integers though. All right, so a reminder, your number line is a diagram that shows numbers as points on a line, just on a line. Okay, now all the numbers that are to the right of 0, we already talked about this. We know that those are your positive numbers. So everything that's going this way, these numbers, no matter if they're integers or rational numbers, they are positive. Fractions, decimals, doesn't matter. If they're on the right-hand side of 0, they are positive. Numbers that are on the left of 0, those numbers are all negative. Again, even if they're decimals, fractions, whatever, they are all negatives. How is this going to help us with comparing and ordering them? Well, we talked about this a couple times before, and you probably heard about this or talked about this in other classes, but the further to the right that a number is, so the further to the right on the number line, doesn't matter if it's positive or negative, but the further to the right that it is, the greater the value. Okay, so any number, so if I'm looking at 4 and negative 3, since 4 is further to the right, 4 is the bigger number. Okay. On the flip side of the coin, any number that is to the left, so the further left, the smaller the value is. Okay, so the numbers that are further left, so again, if I'm looking at negative 3 and 4 and I'm looking for the smaller number, that's going to be negative 3. This helps us because then when we are comparing numbers, okay, we can look at them and say, the further the number is, so when comparing numbers, the number further left is the smaller number. So the number further left is the smaller number. Now, you can also change that or add to it and say the number that is further right is the bigger number, the bigger valued number, the greater number. Okay, so let's take a look at how this works. So which number has the least value, -1 or -6? Well, you have 0 right here on your number line, and -1 comes directly after it. And then we know that to get to -6, we have to keep going left. Since -6 is further to the left, it has the smaller value. So -6 is the smaller value because it is further to the left. All right. So that's how number lines are going to help us with ordering and comparing, even when it comes to our decimals. So just think, when you're plotting your numbers or when you're thinking of a number line, as you move to the right, so if you're starting with 0, as you move to the right, your numbers go up. Same thing, and I'm just talking about the numbers. I'm not talking about the value. So as I'm counting to the right, I'm going 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, it's the same thing on the left. As I count to the left, I'm going -1, -2, -3, -4, -5. So my numbers go up, but my value goes down. Okay, again, everything in negative world is opposite. So let's try this one. -12 or -8, which one has the least value? All right, well, I know, like I said, if I start at 0 and I'm in the negative world, I'm going to have to work my way this way. So 1, 2, 3, and those are all negatives. So I'm going to get to -8, but I'm going to have to keep going left to get to -12. So -12 is going to be my lesser value. Let's look at number 2. If you want to try this one and check your answer, pause and then come back. All right, so -9, so I would get to -9 before I would get to -15. So working my way left, I'd get 0, and then I'd get to -9, but then I would get to -15 after that. So -15 is going to be my smaller value. Which one is the greater value, -1 or -100? Well, -1 is right after the 0, meaning it's going to be way further to the right on the number line than -100. So -1 is my greater value. All right. Now I have -3 4/10 and -3 6/10. All right, so here I know that if I was in the positive world, it would be 3 4/10, 3 5/10, 3 6/10. And this is in the positive world. But in the negative world, it's going to be the opposite. So 3 4/10, and then 3 5/10, and then 3 6/10. What that means is -3 4/10 is further to the right, so it is actually the larger value between those two. Right? So now we're going to order from least to greatest. What I can do is I can look and I can decide right away what's my biggest and what's my smallest. So let's look at these numbers. Here, all of these numbers are negative, so negative, 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 0, negative. Well, 0 is going to be furthest to the right then because all of these negative numbers have to be to the left. And then I know, based on how close they are to 0, 16 is further away from 0 than any of these other numbers. So -16 is going to be my smallest. And then the next closest is -7, and then -5, and then -2. So you can really use 0 to help you figure out your values of your numbers and least to greatest. So now here I have 3 negative numbers and 2 positive. Well, I know 5 is bigger than 3, so 5 has to be my biggest, and then 3. Because we're really good with ordering positive numbers. Now, when it comes to negative numbers, which one of these is furthest away from 0? Since -8 is furthest away from 0, it's going to be my smallest. Furthest away from 0 to the left, too. So my next furthest away from 0 is -4, and then -3. For the next one, I'm going from greatest to least, so we have to make sure to read directions carefully. But now I'm working with decimals. So I have to look at my numbers, and I have to look at, so I have 1 7/10, 3 2/10, 1 2/10, and then 1. But these are all negatives. So since -3 2/10 is further away from 0, it's going to actually, instead of being my smallest or my biggest number, it's going to be my smallest number. All right, so it's going to go last because it is my smallest number. My biggest number is the one that's going to be closest to 0 because it's going to be further to the right because it's negative. So that's going to be -1. right? And then negative 1 and 2/10 is going to be closer to 1 than negative 1 and 7/10. Okay, because 2 is smaller than 7, so it's closer to 1. Another way you can look at this is you can order it as if it were, as if they were positives. So 1 and 7/10, 1 and 2/10, 3 and 2/10, and then just 1. And if we were going biggest to smallest, we know 3 and 2/10 would be our biggest because we're working with positives. And then all of these are 1s, so I have to look at the next column. My next biggest is 7, so it'll be 1 and 7/10. And then 2, because again, this is 0. So 1 and 2/10, and then 1. But since these are all negative numbers, I would have to reverse the order. All right, so your next one, again, your greatest, your biggest value is going to be the one that would be closest to 0, or would be your smallest value if it were positive. So let's try doing it that way. Let's try looking at it as if they were positives. Okay, and then remember we add in these extra zeros here. So this column doesn't help. This column doesn't help. Okay, and I'm looking for my biggest. Well, both of these have 5s here, and this is a 0, so this one's out. But this one has a 5, where this one has a 0. So in positive world, 0 and 555 thousandths is my biggest. Then it's going to be 0 and 55 hundredths, because there's a 5 here where the other one has a 0. And then 0 and 5/10. But because it's negative world, it's actually going to reverse in order. Right? So you're going to get the opportunity now to do a couple of problems on your own. So again, these are your situational problems where you're going to determine what integer represents each situation and what does 0 represent. And then over here, you're ordering and comparing, making sure to read carefully. So the first one is least to greatest. Second is greatest to least. Again, make sure if you have any questions, write them down in your notes, type them in your notes, type them in the Google Classroom comments section, or shoot me an email. And we will go over some problems in class, and you guys will have some time to practice again in your next class.